Testing, 1, 2, 1, 2, testing. It can be a little louder. Let me see. Yeah, just a little bit louder. Test, 1, 2, 1, 2.
Check, check. I think you have to turn it on, and I have a bit of a cold, so you may have to turn it up a little bit. Join us. No, I'm just going to use this so you can. Okay, a little more. Okay. So maybe those fans could be turned off, though. They're really noisy. It's not bad. This way. You guys, are we ready to begin? Okay. So I'd like to welcome Michael Century, who happened to be in town. So it was a little bit of a last-minute presentation. But, of course, we stream and we record everything. So this is for our posterity. And hopefully there's people online who are watching us. Actually, Michael is someone who's been around for quite a while dealing with issues that a lot of people are just starting to think about. And he has recently joined the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute as chair of the department there, actually only in August 2002. What he is really well known for is as someone who headed up and started the media arts section at the Banff Media Arts Center that is really famous for bringing in a lot of interdisciplinary workshops, think tanks, artist productions, etc. He was the instigator of the Art and Virtual Environments project in 91 to 94. He was a program manager at the Canadian Centre for the Information Technology Innovation, a federal research lab in Montreal for responsibility for new media funding. And from 96 to 98, he served as a policy advisor to the Federal Department of Canadian Heritage. Since 97, he's been the principal of Next Century Consultants, focusing on new media and cultural policy for various public and university sector clients. For the Rockefeller Foundation, he researched and wrote actually quite a fantastic report entitled Pathways to Innovation in Digital Culture, which I have. I have the New Media, New Funding Models by Pamela, and then the really good one that I actually used and that was very helpful to me is the one I just mentioned. So tonight's talk is a little bit of a surprise to me, so I'm not really sure what to expect, which is always a good thing. It's kind of like going to the movies without knowing the plot. So let's see what Michael has in store for us. Please welcome Michael Century.
I have to disappoint you, Victoria. You've already been in the audience to hear much of what I'm going to do today. Because you heard me speak at the Banff Center at a conference called Bridges. So I changed the title.
Okay, that was sneaky.
Thanks, Victoria, and hello to everybody out there in Radio Land, Internet Land. This is a great setup. I feel like I'm able to be in show business or something with all the lights and great equipment. So the title of this talk, which is going to be copiously illustrated by pictures and in particular diagrams that I made, I have to explain where this comes from. And I take it I'm speaking mostly to artists and designers. Yeah. And I come from a background of media arts, but I became interested in studying the history and in particular the social history of the change between the analog and the digital. So what you're going to hear is mostly going to be a talk about the way in which people made alliances and made collaborations in the earliest time of the computer, the time when the computer really didn't make any sense to try to do art with. This is in the 60s and 70s, when it was nothing but a calculator, calculating personnel files and payrolls and so forth. And I have called this a sociological study because what I'm really not going to do much of today, I'm not going to talk much about aesthetics as in, or criticism. I'm going to talk more about how the different institutions and the different social settings were able to support or not support this innovation. So I'm from Canada, and I began by asking, why was it that a lot of the software that became really popular to use in computer animation in the 80s, and a lot of the animators too actually grew up in Canada. Why was it that there was that concentration? A lot of people have commented on it, and often people say, well, it had something to do with the National Film Board, but I wanted to know more deeply what actually happened, and I wanted to find out what happened in comparison to what was going on at the same time in the United States. So the methodology was to reconstruct the activity in 6 different sites, 6 sites that I call studio laboratories. So you see at the bottom of this slide the phrase studio laboratory. There are 2 main concepts that I've kind of developed in doing this research. One is about the institution, and I consider the studio laboratory a new institutional form, a site for design and development of software for creative expression. Now there's a longer genealogy of this, which I don't have time to go into today. I did write about it in the report that Victoria mentioned, that goes back to earlier 20th century experiments. But that's the first piece of it, the place that supports and the institutional home that supports collaboration. The second idea that I base this on, I call it the epistemic cultures, as a concept to bridge between the worlds of technology, science, and art. And again, that's another sort of, that's a theoretical direction that I won't stress in this, but you're going to see that those 2 ideas, the idea of epistemic cultures and the idea of studio laboratories, are the kind of analytic terms I use to make sense of all this, what happened in history. So I'm going to give you today a little bit of the theory, but what I'm going to focus on is the history, because I think that's the most fun stuff. You see actually what happened in these 6 places. And as you listen to this, I think you're going to be hearing a story about change in a time that seems almost prehistoric. But many of the issues matter today. They matter in terms of how we go about adapting and innovating and repurposing technologies in the arts in pretty much the same way. So that's what I'm all about here. There's a historical frame that I like to talk about where just one second, I want to see if I have the right image after this. No, I don't. Okay. There's a historical frame that I put into the discussion that is called Pathways to Innovation in Digital Culture, that places the development of the new sites for innovation in relation to waves of innovation that go back to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And the whole idea here is that, the whole idea here is that each wave is powered, as it were, by a breakthrough in some kind of major factor. Early on it was water power. That was the time of textiles and ceramic and the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And each of these waves, this is 1845, 1900, 1950, up to the last wave, which is based on, as what we all know, breakthroughs in computing power and media. Hello? Yeah.
Here you don't have...
Here? What are you pointing to?
the fifth wave.
Yeah.
You have it until 2020, approximating, I guess. So, where is biotechnology and nanotechnology?
The way, okay, that's the perfect question. These are accounting for the building out, the big changes after the factor gets cheap and easy to reproduce. So those new technologies are right now not at that stage yet. They are at the stage where they remain expensive, not yet. In my view, the answer to your question is that they are like chips and bandwidth were in the previous wave. You see what I mean? And I'm going to, and going back over this, what I found as I did this research is that over the course of the 20th century, a variety of these institutes I call studio labs grew up in essentially. There was a big influence of the Bauhaus in the early 20th century, but this concentration in the 60s, where you see names that are quite familiar, you see Bell Labs, EAT, Experiments in Art and Technology, and European places like Philips, MIT, all in the 60s. And it's interesting because these were all the places that were beginning to experiment with electronics in the arts, right? And that's at the time when it was really hard to do. That's at the time when the breakthrough hadn't happened, and the pioneering work was actually what was being worked on there. Now, I point out in this chart that the more recent wave, the one that we're in now, is accompanied by many new centers that I was an actor in, for example, the Banff Center here, Media Lab at MIT, and many others. And this wave of new centers were mostly about media arts, weren't they? They were mostly about exploiting the innovations that, for the most part, were being worked on in the labs back here. And I think that we're getting a far afield from the main topic of animation, but it helps to explain why I was interested. What I wanted to do in this study was look at what was going on in this period. I'm pointing, if you can't see, to the 50s, to the 60s and 70s, because I wanted to understand the dynamics of these places when it was really hard. Actually, when it was much less obvious, and in some ways, Victoria's question makes a lot of sense, because the analog to using the computer in that period is something like using biotech or nanotech today. So in other words, that sort of relation of being advanced in relation to the build-out of innovation, I think, is likely to happen. I'm not going to elaborate on this, but we can come back to it in questions. So the period I'm focusing on is from the mid-60s to the mid-80s. And I'm focusing on computer animation. I'm focusing on the early work when artists began to meet the computer. And I've made a little chart here. What you see here is a kind of layout of key places. Now, if you go to the standard story, the standard kind of history of what happened in computer animation, you tend to see a single line. A line, I was at SIGGRAPH in 1999, and for example, they showed a film, History of Computer Graphics. And they tell a kind of celebratory story, almost like the victory of the agenda that began with the military funding at MIT and ended up with Hollywood. In other words, I'll show you just a little slideshow of the early graphics, which was in military labs that built, motivated by funding of anti-aircraft surveillance type stuff, and then led to Sutherland system, the Sketchpad, which built the first interactive graphics, and then Sutherland went to Utah. He was the one who thought of the head-mounted display and put a big emphasis on virtual reality, on modeling the real world. This was a film that came out of one of the Sutherland students, Catmull, who then went on to start Pixar. And that sort of linear story that I've just sort of given you 10 images of tends to be how the history is told. And I wanted to tell a more complicated story. I wanted to tell a story that included a lot more nuance, and in particular, you see the yellow line. I wanted to include the border between Canada and the United States, beginning this whole project in Canada, and wanting to understand the real variety of conditions. So the yellow line that I drew here is the line roughly representing the border between Canada and the US. And up above the line, you see that the National Film Board actually, and the that's NFB is the acronym for National Film Board, and the NRC were parallel to many of these other more frequent, more numerous US places, but that a great deal of what we're familiar with in computer animation, soft image, alias, and so forth, descended from that work. So that alternative story is what I was interested in talking about. And the way I diagrammed this picture, this is what Victoria already saw when she was at the Banff Center. She saw these pictures. This is another version of the historical chart, but now reduced, very deliberately reduced to simple diagrams. So what we're going to do for most of the rest of this talk is we're going to talk about the main people and the main projects that occurred in each of these labs. Bell Labs, MIT, John Whitney, Electronic Visualization Lab in Chicago. The mainstream story, the one that I pointed to earlier, this story, is the same as this line that goes from Utah University, MIT, Utah, to Pixar. And then the final one is about the Canadian National Film Board. To explain what these diagrams mean and to explain what this sort of sociological approach is all about, what I was interested to do was to show there were two main ways in which the work took place. As I said before, the studio laboratory is the hybrid institution, but there were two parts, two ways in which it took place. Either, and the diagramming shows that it could be a circle with a square in it or a square with a circle in it. Now, I'm making these dichotomies deliberately simple. So a circle with a square in it means that, for example, a cultural organization or a studio in which a scientist would come to work. And the square with a circle in it is the opposite. An artist, for example, going to work in a laboratory. And quite a lot of the activity was of that sort. Computers were very rare and very difficult to get their hands on. And so they existed in labs or in big corporations in the 1960s and 70s. And the other approach, what I call the multi-institutional approach, you see the diagrams here actually link two institutions rather than an individual being part of a larger institution. This indicates institutions coming together, one being, say, a studio and the other a lab, on a common project. Or this diagram, the one after it, which shows a kind of evolution of the collaboration where what was at first just an experiment becomes like a third term, a place in between. So that's what the symbols are. That's how I define the symbols. And to just show you again the way this occurred is about 1964 to 68 was when all the early experiments occurred. And then there was a second period, early 70s. Technology remains very, very difficult it remains an era of mainframes and mini computers, but in some cases the first attempts were able to be carried forward. In other words, this is a picture to show that that people move forward with their ideas and had a chance to develop them. And the third image shows that in several of the cases, it didn't just happen once, but it went further. So it shows really a kind of path of diffusion. In studying all of these things, back to the idea of the epistemic cultures. An epistemic culture is a term coming from the sociology of science and technology. The author is Karen Noor-Satina, who wrote a book called Epistemic Cultures about how sciences construct knowledge. And her point is that we make a mistake if we talk about science as though it was a singular thing. There are different ways in which science constructs knowledge. And her example was the way in which high-energy physics involves thousands of people spread out across many different collaborating labs, and in which the work is abstract and semiotic. And that's compared in her study to molecular biology, where individual experimenters, more or less working alone and working very much with their hands, have a very different method. And so she uses the term epistemic cultures to say that there are different ways in which sciences construct knowledge. And I've taken this idea on board because I think it's true and useful to understand that in some ways the same point can be made about artists. Artists in some ways are more like scientists. Some artists are in some ways more like scientists than they are like other artists. And what I found in this study is that I could observe three different kind of groupings. And these are the names I gave to them. There's the epistemic culture of the vanguardist, that of the rational artist, and that of the instrumental bricoleur. These came out of the studying of the 6 sites. So what are these terms meant to? There are many dimensions, but the two that I'm going to use to emphasize how they play out is in terms here of the way in which they think about the human capabilities on the one hand in the first dimension, and the second is the way they think about change, the way they think about historical change. So the vanguardist has a view of of human capabilities that the person, the individual artist has. Basically, the boundaries are infinite. You can conceive of new media forms, new sensory possibilities that have never been conceived of before. And the idea of time is driven by rupture. It's driven by thinking up new forms that have a radical change. The rational artist is more working in terms of linear progress. The idea is that people don't have the capacity to expand so infinitely. In fact, people are basically fixed in their capabilities. And it's more like the normal scientist who is working within a set of sort of known boundaries. The instrumental bricoleur in my observation is more interesting and more subtle in several ways. This is the idea that human capabilities are inseparable from techniques. That in fact, as we use a new setup, a new dispositif, to use the term that Foucault made popular, we actually discover what we are capable of. So it's difficult to separate out the technique from the human. And that's where, we have since seen a great deal of theory about that, but cyborg theory and other ways to talk about the kind of inseparability of technique and human capability. Now, in this particular historical study, the instrumental bricoleur is one who is intensely involved with developing a new platform, a new tool, a new setup with every new work. So the case of the vanguard, the idea is create something new that leaps over human capabilities, rupture, inventing the future. The rational artist works along a line of linear progress. And the instrumental bricoleur is more, the innovation is at the local level, at the level of every work. And there's a kind of attempt to discover what can be said in the process of working with materials. For those, I should maybe just stop. Bricoleur is from the French, and it means to tinker. It means to play with materials. So it became used in English a lot when the anthropologist Lévi-Strauss described what we call the savage mind, the kind of knowledge, the kind of concrete knowledge that the Brazilian natives that he studied, for instance, had as a kind of science of the concrete. And so that's where bricolage has become kind of used a lot.
So Michael, can I ask a question?
Please.
Are these models ever embodied in a sort of like a single human subject, or is this sort of like does this model transcend like human subjectivity, or can you identify a certain human with one of these categories, or is any human subject a combination in certain ratios of those three categories?
I think that people tend to have more or less of one of them, and what I'm going to now talk about are the sites from which I derive these generalizations. Okay? These ideas came from, and I'm introducing them in advance, these ideas came from the study I made of the interactions between artists and programmers in these 6 sites. So now I'm going to show, to answer your question, I'm going to show the examples of why I think it's useful to classify people this way. I don't think that these are pure 100% clean categories. No. I think that they are useful, though, in coming to some idea of why certain kinds of people can work better with each other than others. Okay?
I have another question.
Machiko, is that you?
Well, with this and the audio paper.
Sorry, I'm not hearing you.
Yeah.
Let me just give a mic because we're streaming. Yesterday I was watching you guys, and when
off microphone. Yeah, my question is, with this list and also with the table that you're referring about this history of computer graphics, I wonder why, for example, the research that took place at the University of Montreal, which became the basis of soft image, and also the kind of relationship between French-Canadian researchers, artists, and French research, like the SGI and Sogitech and TDI brought the Explorer, which became the basis of wavefront areas, for example. So I think this French part is very important in computer graphics history. Yeah. So I was just wondering why it's not there.
It is there under the National Film Board because that was French. The connections were actually what you're talking about at the University of Montreal. Those people were working at both places. I don't, in this talk much about the University of Montreal, but you're right. Let me now explain the details, and then you'll see I do address your point about...
Okay, yeah, but NFB is also divided into the French part and British part, and also like the Talmans, they were not exactly working with NFB, even though some of the works
they were not, but I'll come back to your question when I get to that section. So now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give a little overview of these 6 places, okay? The first one is called was ATT Bell Labs, famous laboratory where much of the information age concepts, the transistor and well, Unix, many of the great inventions were at Bell Labs. And what's not known is how intensely involved ATT was in supporting and welcoming artistic experiment in the 1960s. So some of you know this history, I'm sure, about experiments in art and technology, early work in computer music, and the graphics work of people like Knowlton. Now, it's Ken Knowlton that I'm going to mainly discuss today. So Knowlton designed a first language called BFlix. BFlix standing for Bell Flix. And what you see on the right are some pictures made with this language in the 60s. What Knowlton says is that his interest was in writing. This was the first high-level language. Okay, it was nothing. There was nothing interactive about it, but it was designed to be a language capable of producing complex results with very few instructions, like what we would recognize today in terms of things like cellular automata. Complexity produced by simple directions. And so this was a very advanced conceptual language, right? That's the main point. It was, but Knowlton thought that this would be of use and of interest to the general user. At first, he made illustrative movies, but he had no background in art, and the movies he made actually were more illustrating the program than trying to do something artistic with it. And a filmmaker called Stan Vanderbeek was introduced to Knowlton. This was through EAT, through Experiments in Art and Technology. Knowlton had worked on some of the visual projections. By the way, Knowlton was not merely a filmmaker. We would see some of his work more in terms of things like environmental or immersive cinema. He was very, very involved with multi-screen projections. He built a space called Moviedrome, which was a kind of space to saturate a semi-sphere, a spherical surface with many images at once. So Knowlton was quite a far-out multi or poly artist. Vanderbeek was, and he came to Knowlton. And what Knowlton said, as this relationship started, was, I wanted to turn him into a programmer. He would come up with with ideas that I hadn't thought of. Have I lost this? And then we would evolve the language together. This is the key sort of report that I got from speaking to Knowlton about this. Vanderbeek died in 1985, by the way. We would evolve the language together. But instead, Vanderbeek would come in with visual ideas that were way beyond what I was working on at the time. So he built basically a special meta language just for Vanderbeek. And yet, Vanderbeek never used it. So this is kind of the summary of how one of the actors reported. Vanderbeek himself wrote quite a lot about this, and in the larger study that I've written on this, I've quoted some of the frustrations that he had from his side. So the point is that Knowlton wrote a language that projected forward, wasn't based in any way on actual practice. It wasn't based on any knowledge, really, of how filmmakers worked at all. He was kind of conceiving a way to create dynamic pictures in a very complex using simple commands, but which would produce complex, evolving kinds of forms. And Vanderbeek was the kind of guy who they just didn't connect. They didn't connect in any way in which was meaningful for either for Knowlton in terms of the evolving of the language. What Vanderbeek did, though, which I think is interesting, he made a series of films. This was his compromise, which was based on transforming letters. BFlix was really based on ASCII characters. Dots were made up. There were dots in it, but a dot was just primitives, and various letter forms were easy to do. And what Vanderbeek wanted to do was a kind of concrete poetry, a kind of changing in time or dynamic typography. And so the series of films he made were capable of happening in the language, and they found a kind of compromise through the poem field concept. Now, B-Flix, as far as Knowlton was concerned, was a powerful language, but it was never diffused and nobody learned it. He actually tried to teach more people this when he was at Santa Cruz for a short period, and it didn't really carry forward. It didn't diffuse as a language. And so when you see this in the diagram, this scene is a standalone. Those of you who have studied this know also that Lillian Schwartz worked at Bell Labs with Ken Knowlton, and I didn't cover that in this. It's not that it was not important, but it didn't reveal anything different in terms of how the relationship. In fact, Schwartz herself never tried to program, never actually was close to, she was more like an art director than trying to understand the computational image. So Vanderbeek at least was attempting, but they didn't really succeed. And so this, in my larger frame, was a kind of clash, a clash that succeeded in making a series of important films, but which did not produce any kind of meeting of minds. Now, the term epistemic culture is useful here because the individuals, neither of them really found a way of working practically, given the state of the technology at the time. Vanderbeek, in fact, was more of a vanguardist. He wanted to create new forms far beyond unimagined forms, and yet he had no concrete way of playing and manipulating the language. I'm going to move forward now to go through several other examples. We're going to end with the example that Machiko asked about, the Canadian example. Here we have the famous John Whitney from Los Angeles, who, one of the big figures in abstract film, visual music is one way it's talked about. And he had a prior practice before he met the computer. He was famous for his abstract films based on, I'm going to show, based on a repurposed analog computer taken from military hardware. Here you see a picture of Whitney in his studio with this was actually an anti-aircraft gun based on machinery, based on cam shafts, based on wheels and gears and so forth. And he always had a kind of theoretical ambition to seek the abstract correspondences between visual and sound pattern. He was pursuing that well before the computer, and as you can see in this clip, this is the machine being used, where you can see he manipulated things, he turned knobs, he could control things in a very iterative way. He would move little bits of patterning, photograph it bit by bit, and control the sort of using it's basically an analog computer where you don't have to specify things with symbolic language, but rather you can do things in a very hands-on, turning of knobs kind of way. This is a bit from the film that he made with his brother. It's signed by James Whitney, and you can see the density of the image. the complexity and the density of the image that is produced with this what's called CAM machine, or anti-aircraft device, repurposed as an analog computer for graphics. Now, he was what he was interested in here was exploring how abstract moving pattern might relate to, as I say, as he said it himself, seeking a digital harmony. And he became increasingly motivated by specific musical ideas like consonance, dissonance, overtones. He was actually seeking a kind of musical language to put into the visual realm. Now, IBM. Oh, sorry, I threw this in because I'm in Los Angeles. This is an example of actually the use of that same machinery for doing special effects, revealing, in fact, how Whitney had close relations both with the avant-garde world, but also with Hollywood studio production. This is the beginning of Hitchcock's Vertigo. Now, IBM was the first corporation to invite an artist to be an artist in residence. And you can picture this as you imagine this is a big square, IBM, the big computer company, having a little circle, an artist working in it. And they made a fellowship. It was lasted a couple of years, 3 years, I think. And what happened was they basically built a front end for Whitney to play with. They gave Whitney a virtual control panel in which he could change parameters image by image, but this was using big mainframe computers, right? So every image would produce a punch card, and then the punch card would all be processed in a batch processing mode. So his work was to explore each image using think of it as a 50-dimensional space, plugging in these different parameters. Now, the first film he made several films called Permutations, and these films I'll give you a little bit of a look at one of them. Were very influential films. These were widely seen in the computer research community, and very quickly became celebrated for IBM. They got, I think, a lot of mileage out of supporting an artist who could see that animated art was possible to make somehow at the computer, and you can see the connection very clearly between Whitney's prior work made with his own machinery and the work done using this IBM mainframe. Now, he was increasingly, as he did more and more computer works. This diagram shows Whitney when he was in the artist in residency program at IBM. And the more initially what Whitney reported was that working with the computer was like hell. It was like taking away his ability to do what he had done before, to be able to play with things and to be able to manipulate and to be able to try things out. And yet he became more and more convinced that this was the way forward because he was driven by this theoretical idea of digital harmony, what I talked about as the aim to bring image and sound into correspondence. So the second diagram here shows that Whitney went forward afterwards and was able to develop further in collaboration with a program. A guy who's called Larry Cuba was his main protege at the time. And it was Cuba who was one of the first generation of computer artists who actually learned to program. And with Cuba, Whitney was able to go a great deal further than in realizing his goal of digital harmony. Interestingly enough, back to the diagram, I'm showing how Whitney goes through a series of institutes, goes to IBM, he did some work at Caltech, and then people like Bob Abel, who used to teach here at UCLA, were very much inspired by that work, and out of Abel came a software company called Wavefront. Okay, so I've talked now about Bell Labs and Whitney, and now I'm going to turn to the work that came out of MIT. I mentioned earlier the importance of the MIT site. MIT Lincoln Labs is where Ivan Sutherland had developed the first ideas of interactive graphics. And you can see here Sutherland manipulating the idea of manipulating and drawing and making simulations at his workstation. Now, Sutherland was had a very kind of narrow idea of what this is for. He imagined the purpose of this to simulate a physical situation, to approach, for example, an aircraft carrier. Now, Sutherland went on to start Evans and Sutherland, which was one of the big simulation-making machines in the 70s and 80s. And so he was really insisting on these films having a kind of purpose, and he kind of questioned. You see this remark, the resulting films, when talking about the abstract notions of filmmakers like Whitney, they may have complex symmetrical patterns which change color and shape as the film progresses. While they are interesting as abstract art, they fail to convey any meaningful message. And this was the sort of dominant sort of culture at MIT. And there was an alternative to this. There was an alternative to this, and this is a guy called Ron Baecker. And Baecker was working in this lab, and he saw a different possibility. Baecker was interested in basically interaction as a medium. And this is what he wrote in 1969. In a medium through dialogue, we form and shape and represent content and meaning, the subject matter of the dialogue. An interactive language must mediate and enhance creative expression of that subject matter. This is the same computer, this is the same lab, and it turns out this is a guy who was very much involved with the experimental film scene at the time. So he was hanging out with filmmakers and watching experimental films, and in particular being exposed to the work of the National Film Board, which was very well known in that time, and especially for experimental animation. And so it's Baecker who made a system called Genesis. This was his doctoral thesis at MIT. And it's not a keyframe system at all, but rather it was designed to allow the light pen to draw motion. Baecker was the first to think of the idea of not drawing an image, but drawing change in time. And so what you see are these very simple, abstracted shapes moving. But what's different is, in his system, is what we'd be familiar with in something like, I don't know, Macromedia Director, where you draw a direction and then the sprite moves around. Well, basically, this is what the Genesis system was in 1969. Similar to that. And he collaborated with animators, was inspired by McLaren's notions from the National Film Board, inspired by those ideas of the animator as an individual artist. And it was this idea, really, that went forward. This is Baecker at MIT Lincoln Labs. He worked with an animator from Harvard called Eric Martin. Actually, Martin ended up as a dean of art at Cal Arts afterwards. And then Alan Kay at Park invited, at Xerox PARC, invited Baecker with the artist, Eric Martin, to come and be artist in residence in the early years when Kay and his group were developing what became known as, well, the first personal computer. And so it's very interesting that for that first demonstration of the graphic user interface at Park, Baecker's idea was one of the most important things that they were trying to implement. The idea of drawing motion that had been first demonstrated at MIT was actually the very first application programmed in Smalltalk as a demonstration of the GUI at Park. It was an important when Alan Kay actually introduced the idea in his published articles, the examples he tended to use were the examples that came out of this very project. The idea of the desktop metaphor, therefore, was in an important way stimulated by some early work in interactive graphics that had an important linkage to the artist experimentation that Baecker did. Now we're going to go to, so that was MIT Lincoln Labs. So I've talked about Bell Labs, I've talked about Whitney, now, and I've talked about MIT. Now we're going to look at the Chicago Circle. This is now known as the Electronic Visualization Lab. I found a very funny diagram. This is from Ted Nelson's book, Dream Machines. Ted Nelson is still alive. He was one of the most important propagandists for the idea of kind of a computer culture as a kind of liberation. The book Computer Lib was, Dream Machines was part of another book that was called Computer Lib. And he gave a talk for you guys. So what kind of shape is he in these days? He's same as ever. That's great. So this is a diagram by Ted Nelson, who was at that time inspired by and working in the Chicago lab. And I think that's another interesting connection, is that when much of what Nelson was inspired by in terms of the capabilities of computers in the early 70s came from the work he did with this group of people in Chicago. And this is a diagram that shows really two systems, that one of which is an analog video system for processing images in real time, and the other which is a digital programming environment by two guys that, this is the diagram of it, two guys that were both scientists, but both developed tools in art departments. So the circle here, one is Ohio State and the other one is University of Illinois at Chicago. And these two systems came together simply by pointing a camera at what all they did is they took the graphics output from the computer, pointed a camera at it, and processed it with the analog video. And this became the basis of some of the more video art-oriented work. This is Standeen's image processor. Dan Standeen is still at the Electronic Visualization Lab, still very productive. And you can see that the device he made, very much a bricolage kind of device, was modeled on analog synthesizers of the time. So you're patching things together. You're patching one signal, making it physically go to another jack, and
then into this output module by pushing the process signal.
can you believe these guys?
All black and white, except that I can very easily adjust the gray level at which that transition is made.
So
That's one primitive processing step. Another primitive processing step
the what?
is the function.
I didn't hear you. Psychedelic times. And I forget. I didn't. No, don't bother, because I'm talking over the sound clips anyway. It's definitely psychedelic times, and the entire basis for this collaboration at the EVL at the beginning was to use the possibilities of the analog side hooked up with the digital. And they weren't purists about it. In fact, they're very interesting when they talk about their status in the growing SIGGRAPH community, that at one time Sandine said that in those early years, some of the more, some prominent, I shouldn't say names maybe, but people came up to them and said, when are we going to get you analog people out of here? Because SIGGRAPH was very much, in those early years, all about what can the computer do, and the EVL people were more, what can we say with any tools that we want to, draw on. Now, the Canadian example is one that I was initially motivated to start this whole project about. I'm not sure how widely known the National Film Board is here. It's lost some of its luster, I think, in the past, but it was organized in the 1930s and 40s by Canada, and it focused not on feature films or on commercial films at all, but on documentary and on experimental animation. And it had a kind of research culture. They had a technical department that was always coming up with new gadgets, and it was led by and inspired by this artist called Norman McLaren, who had a position over there for over 40 years, and he's very much the bricoleur type in my scheme. McLaren is a kind of person who never made the same. If he came up with a new system or a new tool, he would never use it twice. Every film needed to have its own setup, and he was very explicit about this. He trained people in this tradition of artisanal, low budget, the artist maintaining personal creative control, and encouraging a wide diversity of techniques. This is a clip of a film called Begone Dull Care, produced by drawing directly on acetate. And in 1948, McLaren wrote a paper in which he made quite clear what he was about, and this was the influence that he really had at the National Film Board, to attempt to keep at a minimum the technical mechanism standing between a conception and the finished work, to handle personally the mechanisms in as intimate, that do remain in as intimate a way as a painter does a painting, or a violinist his violin, to make the very limitations of the medium, of these mechanisms, when brought in touch with the theme, the growing point for visual ideas, and to make sure that there's always a chance for improvisation at the moment of shooting or drawing. And they were really against this kind of studio ideology of being in favor of the individual artist, the artisanal artist, was in many ways a reaction against the dominant system at the time. And so they were explicitly, as they say, derivative work was absolutely hated. We didn't do any celeb work at all. In fact, we were openly contemptuous of Disney. And against the idea of the traditional industrial model where there's a hierarchy of skills and a kind of sweatshop division of labor, where the lead animators are the people with the kind of creative parts, and then there's a subdivision of skill going down to the in-betweeners. So that was the animation culture at the National Film Board, and it was thriving, especially in the 1960s. It was a period when, if you like, the National Film Board was at its heyday. Now, there's a lab in Canada called the National Research Council. It's probably the most important scientific lab there. And they had in the 1950s and 60s already a kind of openness to welcoming experiments with artists. There had been an electronic musician who was originally a physicist and built some very innovative synthesizers, analog synthesizers. And so there was a kind of intellectual work culture at the National Film Board that was friendly to artists. And when the Canadian scientists began to think about entering the field of computer research, it was with the goal of improving man-machine communication. It wasn't really driven by anything abstract or research in computer theory or anything like that. Rather, it was to understand how computers could make a meaningful contribution to creative work. And they chose, interestingly, they chose two driving applications to work out their research: film animation and music composition. And this was extraordinary in 1967-68 to see such to see a project which didn't try to study anything else. It set up a lab, it got an interactive computer, and it decided to focus only on those two fields. So what happened was, there was an early emphasis on the personal interface. They looked around at the work that was going on. They were influenced by Douglas Engelbart's early demonstration of the graphic of what, well, Engelbart was the inventor of the mouse. He had demonstrated that in '68. So it was a very new idea, but it hadn't diffused anywhere else. And in fact, it went forward in the '70s to Xerox PARC. But earlier than that, it came to Canada, and this was the basis of the system that they built there. So at the National Research Council, they really had no particularly strong knowledge of filmmaking, but one of the developers attended a conference here in Los Angeles. Back then there was no SIGGRAPH. They had a meeting called the Users of Automated Information Display Equipment, or UAID. And that was before SIGGRAPH, that was the place where users and equipment makers would meet annually. And at this meeting in 1969, an animator, actually from Disney, came up and said, "Why don't you study us? Why don't you, if you want to understand how the computer can be used to make pictures, look at how we actually work. When an artist is trained to become an animator, he must first learn to in-between. Why not teach the computer to in-between? That is, to make the in-betweens in full animation." So here was a suggestion from a person in the industry to use the computer in a very particular way. It hadn't been done before, and this is the first person to implement computer in-betweening. So at the National Research Council, you see these very first tests of interpolation. And so Burtnick said, "It struck me that's the way to approach the computer, to have the animator draw just the key images and have the computer fill in the in-betweens." So what happened next was that the National Film Board was approached by the National Research Council to collaborate on what could be done with this idea of computer in-betweening. Peter Foldesh was the artist who the Film Board worked with. He was a freelance artist who had proposed a film using metamorphosis, requiring a lot of transformation in the very script. And you see here a picture in the lab. Foldesh is on the right, and the two developers, Burtnick and Wine, sitting beside them. And they did an early test. It was called metadata. They did it in a couple of sessions, maybe 2-3-hour sessions, and sent that film, metadata, off to the Annecy Animation Festival, and it made such an impression that this quick test that they decided to do something more developed, and that was the film called Hunger. And they produced a film in 1971 whose theme was the injustice of the rich world in relation to the poor of the world. So it was a script with a narrative content, and it depended on metamorphosis. The way that worked was an individual guy who kept on eating and eating until he exploded. And so it's very grotesque, actually. This is just a demonstration of how in-betweening was first used to create a kind of surreal effect of how a body can turn into another body, turn into another shape. And you see how kind of bizarre and surreal it was. Now this film, Hunger, was the very first computer-produced film to get wide recognition outside the computer community. It was nominated for an Oscar, it won a prize at Cannes, and it inspired quite a few people to enter computer graphics. I found in my interviews that many people who saw Hunger in the 70s thought were inspired by that possibility, because it actually was a film that was about something. It had had more than just an abstract kind of demonstration, but it had meaning to them. Here's some more bits from this. This is the fat guy becoming ever more gluttonous. Oops. This is not a QuickTime that runs. Well, anyway, you can get the idea that the guy eats and eats and eats and eats and eats until he gets bloated and explodes. And that is done using smooth interpolation. Now, there's a kind of funny thing about this, because at that time, the interpolation was very machinic, was very mechanical. That was a kind of strict limitation at the time of the program. It was very early. And yet, they made use of that limitation, the very limitation of the sort of simple linear interpolation, to create the mood, to make it all the more persuasive. And so the way to understand this is that in the context of the film board, they were continuing in the McLaren tradition of working with the limitation of the tool. The scientists understood this as a problem, though. Smooth interpolation was, for them, a difficulty, because you needed to be able to do more expressive animation, what we understand more in terms of this is what they actually did. They started to manipulate skeletons to be able to add balance. Those of you who know animation understand how you have to be able to make a great deal more sophistication in the interior of a moving object. And so Burtnick and Wine, the people who made this system, were the first to also do a skeleton technique. Now this was important because when Hunger got a lot of recognition, and it moved forward from the lab at from the lab at the National Research Council to a system that came to the National Film Board. And now this is a picture of one of the early users of that system, Daniel Langlois, as a young man. I don't know if you recognize Daniel there. This isn't, to give you a little more story, I think Meshiko just walked back in. Langlois was the early user of the National Film Board, of the system that came from the National Research Council into the National Film Board. And before he did anything in 3D, he was really immersed in trying to improve and fix that National Research Council system. And at the time, because it had the skeleton technique that had been developed earlier on, it was a bit more sophisticated than other ones. And as he explained it to me, this was one of the things that gave him the idea of being able to draw with splines, which is something he did when he started soft image later. You see, this is Langlois. The National Film Board was able to take the research prototype quite far, but then what happened? Well, if you remember when animation was beginning to explode, the Silicon Graphics machine became the standard machine in about 1983 or 84. And so suddenly, anybody working with older mainframe equipment was challenged to there was a kind of generation change in equipment. And so Langlois was dissatisfied and decided to move on, and that's when he started soft image. to fill in the little point, Langlois was also working at the University of Montreal at night, and it was the film called Tony de Peltry that was programmed by Langlois with 3 other people that made him initially well known in the animation field in 1985. So I've just talked about how there was a transition from the research to a production system at the National Film Board, and there you have this is represented by the little box in which the system is developed, was developed by a third party, and then it entered the box, the square enters inside the film board, and that circle is actually the French division of the National Film Board, because the English division was not very sympathetic to the, ironically enough, it was not very sympathetic to the artisanal individualist tradition. So it was in the culture of French animation that carried forward the kind of individualistic artisan maker tradition that the computer animation was able to grow in the film board. And then I showed the last step when Langlois and some of his colleagues were starting to move the system out of the bounds of the film board, and that became soft image. Show the diagram again, in which what I just talked about can be seen. There's a line in which some key scientific ideas came from the United States to the National Research Council. The National Film Board had its own native tradition, and quite a number of other activities were followed from that. You can see that Alias was also influenced by that early work at the National Research Council. So there's 3 or 4 Canadian results that can be tracked to that. People ask me, so what? You know, you've got all this knowledge and you've recovered all these fascinating things. And I want to return now and briefly conclude, because I've talked now for well over an hour, I think, and relate together the ideas of the epistemic culture and studio laboratory. The idea that I think is fascinating is the way in which the instrumental bricoleur has a broad utility in a variety of settings. In the Canadian setting, the one I talked about, grounded in artisanal animation, and which had a productive sort of following on through the transfer of technology to the film board and then the startup of soft image. How the instrumental bricoleur, the idea that comes from video animation, playing with knobs and dials and that sort of approach, was important at the Chicago Electronic Visualization Lab, grounded in the earlier analog video computing. How the instrumental bricoleur was important also in the discovery of the GUI, the idea of hand drawing, the idea of drawing a vector of time instead of just using the computer to draw shapes. And finally, how Whitney's early analog work had an impact on Hollywood. People like Abel were actually inspired by Whitney's early work. So I'm now at Rensselaer. I want to just, this is the last slide I used. I just put this in because I want to let you know a little bit. Now I'm back in the academic world myself, and I'm in a position to think a little bit about how to apply the study that I made in the work that I'm doing there. And the diagram here that I think was so productive, that I saw repeatedly, was the idea of institutional well, you could think of the square as a department, like a scientific department or a lab, and the circle as a cultural or an art department, and the idea of very constructive things happening when a kind of when two organizations come together but still respect their boundaries. They don't fuse, but they create something common in between. And I think that having looked now at all of this activity in the 60s and 70s and seen how these sorts of collaborations were quite special in what they produced. They were able to support this important bricolage type of experimentation. And now I'm in a position, and what I'm introducing in my institution is the idea of having a linked group. This is actually something that is probably similar in many places, I think here too, where what may be needed is to link together a bunch of people who have multiple interests, but can sustain a kind of ongoing activity without becoming, or necessarily having to become, formally appointed or permanently engaged in the outside their native place. And so what I'm developing at Rensselaer to support collaboration between artists and engineers and scientists is the idea of constellations where we actually bring new people to Rensselaer who would be able and be specifically hired to bridge between their departments and others. So, thank you very much for your attention. I'm very happy to have questions or comments.
So, Michael, it's very, very important basic research in many ways. I think that one aspect that at least your presentation didn't raise at all is actually the relationship of these institutions that you have analyzed and identified to the larger social context. You know, the fact that these institutions themselves were quite different if you look at their position in society. Absolutely. And their sort of like external goals and things like that. So like the National Film Board of Canada compared with MIT's Lincoln Lab, which is a military institution and things like that. So how would, have you actually done this part of the research as well, and how would this aspect, how should this aspect be integrated into this bigger picture that you've been sketching?
Well, yes, I have thought about that. And the example Bell Labs, MIT, Xerox PARC, they all had, as you say, different social positions. I think one way to come at this is to look at the institution that stands out as in some ways unlike any others is the National Film Board. It's a state cultural organization that supports research. In the case of Lincoln Labs, it was a classified military installation where the experimental work was very much happening underground. Nobody even knew about it. Whereas in the case of the Film Board, it was explicit policy to support experimentation, technical experimentation in art. Bell Labs itself is it's an interesting example too, because at that time, it's interesting to compare Bell Labs with IBM, because it was at that time really the bastion of pure science, of open-ended research. And they were able to support scientists, in effect, doing art. And that's not really the case at all with IBM, which was protecting a large market position. I don't think they really ever understood what Whitney was doing, but what they did is they associated their name with creativity. Whereas
And
Bell Labs,
you
I
can
think,
see
was,
it in their so like advertising films in the 60s, which
Right.
used Whitney's animations as a sort of like a special gimmick.
right. Whereas I think at AT&T there was, for a short period of time, the possibility of taking seriously the idea that what the artist would experiment with could have scientific validity, but it did not last very long. The interesting case there is that AT&T became less and less interesting for the scientists as it moved toward being deregulated. Remember, it was a monopoly? And when Knowlton was talking about this, he was really referring, and Max Matthews is the same, all these people, Billy Kluver. The golden age of art and technology was when the monopoly was going on, when they could have really, they didn't really have to worry about market position. And when it was broken up in the late 70s, all the art technology people, the last of them left. I'm giving you an anecdotal answer to your question because your question is a very difficult one to make a generalization about. Do you have any sort of level of how to generalize about your question to comparing the different institutions with social standards?
No, I just basically think that we probably should. I'm not sure if there's a way of answering if we just try to look at this framework that you had been sketching, which is the framework of these institutions.
Yeah.
Because I mean that there were other factors as well. There were other dynamics like the relationship between like certain countercultures in the 60s, early 70s. There was the relationship, in some sense at least, with the art world as well. Yeah. And they were actually